quite, interesting about leaving Christianity and starting to understand that the very roots of that faith actually have a lot, which is Jewish, have a lot more nuance. Now, I didn't necessarily become Jewish myself, but it gave me a much broader appreciation for the direction people go in when it comes to the choices they make in life, when it comes to how you see tension between people, between good guys and bad guys. It may not be based on the same kind of moral absolutes that come from a more simplistic narrative or belief system. One of the things that I saw was that Christianity or the church often misinterpreted Jewish morality, which is actually far more complex than the more simplistic narrative that often gets handed over in Christian terms. For example, one of the things that we get are these kind of black and whites. In my previous video, I talked about how intimacy is often put in a kind of good versus evil context. If you're going to have intimate contact with someone, you got to be married. And if you're not married, it's evil. And if you do it, you're going to hell. That's not really quite how it works in Jewish circles. And I kind of cover that in the last video. And one of the reasons for that too is that nuance comes from an understanding that God or the divine makes morality something that kind of springs from creation itself. They're kind of like the moral laws are something that you would probably naturally come to in many cases if you were just to kind of appear like a caveman on the planet without any access to religions and books or what have you. Tell the truth. It makes it easier to negotiate, as you deal with people in the future, because they'll see you as someone they can trust and do business with. Honor your parents because they're the ones who are trying to teach you things. They've got more experience, and so by honoring your parents, you're probably going to learn things more effectively. And not murdering is another one that also will keep you in better stead with the community as well if you're trying to form one. So there are these what they would call delivered laws. They're delivered by God, by in essence the forces of nature themselves, that given enough time and focus, a lot of them can be derived from just living in reality. And in that sense, God is kind of embedded into the fabric of nature. You don't even have to believe in some kind of God or divine being in order to pull out the connection that we have to these truths. Now, there's also what can be derived from the delivered divine law. And that's kind of similar, but it probably has some variance. But that's one of the other things I found interesting, is that when it comes to not lying, for example, there's all kinds of nuances about what that means if you really want to kind of expand on that and dig into what lying is, what's fraud, what's misdirection, what other forms of deception might there be, and how can we kind of codify it maybe over time and over history. So that's what one would consider derived law from divine law, and those things are fairly closely linked. And then there's also legislated morality, which is another one that's part of the Jewish tradition, and that can be something that gets debated a lot more. It's kind of like one of the things that they have, which needs sometimes legislated correction, I would say at times, is that you get things where you're not supposed to work on Sunday or on the Sabbath. For people who are Jewish, it would be on Saturday. That raises a lot of questions, like what is work? Is work picking up sticks? Is work just not going to the office? And those things get debated and discussed. And over time, sometimes maybe some of these laws, from some people's perception, get too cumbersome. And so those things are more negotiated. The boundary line, if you will, to keep within moral good stead begins to shift and change. For certain groups, it's far more restrictive. For others, it's not. And so each one of those categories have varying levels of compliance, I guess. But there's probably more commonality when it comes to what is directly, what we directly connect with, kind of like the laws of gravity. The majority of people just won't jump off a building without a parachute. But then there is some variance on what kind of parachute you use and, how you pack a parachute and then you get into whether or not you can, use a parachute on the Sabbath or on Sunday or whatever. So, there are different gradients, and you get people who, maybe don't even use a parachute. Maybe they'll just reject it altogether because they're using a wingsuit or because they're using a bungee cord or they're trying some radical maneuver. But you get more or less agreement depending on how close you are to these sort of divine principles. So I found that was far more reflective of life. Life has a lot of gradations and variances. And that was one of the things that kind of drew me into, when I was writing characters. You don't necessarily have a character that just believes in the right thing and one that believes in the wrong thing. Maybe the battle is over two different correct ways to approach something, but a couple different interpretations that are based on good intentions can take you in very different directions and maybe polarize people even. So that was one of the areas that I thought was quite interesting about leaving Christianity and starting to understand that the very roots of that faith actually have a lot, which is Jewish, have a lot more nuance. Now, I didn't necessarily become Jewish myself, but it gave me a much broader appreciation for the direction people go in when it comes to the choices they make in life, when it comes to how you see tension between people, between good guys and bad guys. It may not be based on the same kind of moral absolutes that come from a more simplistic narrative or belief system. And I guess in that sense, moral law has a kind of divine calibration that's rooted in our real experience, in the consciousness we have of existence. And this was something that that more kind of delivered to you when you're a kid, kind of Bible story, Sunday school narrative, I felt had to be broken through, and I had to kind of move past all that, because when you're writing characters or when you're living life, you're stepping into something where a lot of what we need to learn comes from making mistakes and kind of recalibrating. And a lot of really kind of divine moral journeying requires that. It's actually part of how we grow and develop as people, as characters, engaging or pressing against maybe, or kind of moving into the gray zones of the moral areas of life. So we kind of understand where things get a little too hot, or where we need to kind of stay between the lines and where we can color outside of them. That's all part of the divine journey, if you will. It's part of calibrating ourselves to what's best. And I think that, in a way, is what I would see as being kind of the voice of God or the divine law. It's sort of the meta form of all that is good or all that is best, all that is right. And, once you get to the point, it's kind of like when you're playing a video game and, you make a bunch of mistakes, but you have an earlier save point. So you kind of turn it off or you reload back to the last point before you screwed it up. I mean, life is kind of our opportunity. And then you keep playing the game. And when the game is over, if you stitch together everything, it looks like you've done it all right. But in reality, there are all these little areas where you made mistakes. You just went back to an earlier point and kind of kept playing from there. So, you get a good solid score at the end of the game because your mistakes didn't really count because of how you're playing. Now, in life, we don't get to kind of roll back time. But I think in that sense, what life is it's an opportunity to kind of try and step into things and understand, we got burned there. Let's, get up again and try again a different way. And that's how the kind of divine calibration works. And ultimately, when we're older and wiser, I mean, that's what our experience tells us. I was young and dumb. You hear that a lot. I did a lot of things this way, and I learned from that, and now I do them this way. And so I think that kind of process as well in storytelling is much more interesting than just having someone who knows the answers in that universe off by heart and just kind of is always kind of marching in the right direction. That's kind of bland and boring. The lessons we learn come a lot from the recalibration, the gray zones, or making mistakes.